If we were forced to ascribe a date to the moment that we learn common things, things that everyone is expected to know, and thereafter make a list of all of these things, I think that most of us would be ashamed at that ledger, at all the things that we learned so late. And I think there are advantages also that some have over others, and probably there are many. One of them is place, or proximity. Proximity to gaining these certain kinds of knowledge, or proximity to a place where you could gain them. I grew up in a northern Utah mountain valley that was not famous and not in proximity to the world that I saw depicted on the television screen that I loved so much. But we did have one thing. We had an interstate freeway so that people could come in and out as they wish. And there was an entrance through a canyon and one exit through another canyon. And in the first canyon, Weber Canyon, it had this interesting formation. This is called Devil's Gate. And you can see the Weber River passing through it, very treacherous and dangerous to cross. And at the exit of the other canyon, there was this formation. This is Devil's Slide. And I want to take a minute here to appreciate a couple things about this. First is how appropriately American it is to name dangerous or terrible or evil things after the devil. And this is very popular in Utah, okay? Which tells you a lot about Utah. The other thing is that I'm really amazed every time when I look at this because I realize it really mimics my current classroom. You have an entrance through the gate of hell, you have a passing through the valley of shadow and death, and then a slide at the end. And then the last thing is that I think it's enough for us Utahns to finally admit that really nothing conjures less fear, it evokes less fear in a person than imagining the devil enjoying himself on a slide. But see, these are the kinds of contradictions that I came from that made me, and I'm not ashamed of them. But in all of my childhood ambition to see the world outside of my valley, in my desire to go online to the brand new internet, in my obsession with ordering maps from all over the country, in my desire to gain kinds of knowledge that I didn't think my valley could offer, I never even knew my valley deeply. And I know this because there are mountain ridges and hills that I know by sight and heart, but not by name. And that there are pools and springs and trails that I never stepped into or walked down. There are even parts of my parents' house where I was raised that my feet never touched. In a different time and place, in June of 2015, I was awake at 3 a.m. in a small third-floor room of a hostel in Mar del Plata, Argentina, which is a coastal city in the province of Buenos Aires, and also, as it happens, the same city where my mother was raised many years before. I was awake and sitting at a small table and alternating between two things. One was watching a small television screen in the corner displaying images of the Argentine landscape, and the other was watching my father, who was asleep and sleeping fitfully in the bed beside me. He had just been released a few hours before from the emergency room of a crowded hospital, where he received a blood transfusion, suffering from liver disease and complications from diabetes, and we were both far from home. He from the same home where I was raised, and I from a new home in Atlanta. At about that moment, in that in-between space between waking and sleeping, I was sort of amazed to realize that the programming on the Argentine cultural public channel Encuentro called for, and this is true, a rebroadcast in English of a Canadian talk show from 50 years before. And in this sort of eerie black and white, two men appeared on the screen. One of them was this man, American author Norman Mailer, here looking and avoiding all eye contact as possible. And the other was this man, Marshall McLuhan, who's a Canadian philosopher and media theorist who in many ways predicted the way our culture would change because of media and information technology. And because I knew that moment was strange, and I already explained to you the sort of strange place I came from, I knew to pay attention and to look for devils. And none appeared. But McLuhan said something that I haven't stopped thinking about since.
There is in IBM, for example, a phrase that information overload produces pattern recognition. Now, this is the kind of reversal I mean. When you give people too much information, they instantly resort to pattern recognition in other words, to structuring the experience. And I think this is part of the artist's world. The absolute indispensability of the artist is that he alone, in the encounter with the present, can give the pattern recognition. He alone has the sensory awareness necessary to tell us what our world is made of.
This phrase, information overload produces pattern recognition, in that moment washed over me in a way I can't fully express, so I'm trying to do it now. And it's one that I've taken to the classroom for my students. As a teacher who has since decorated that classroom with all of the maps that I worshipped as a child. And I asked them, who better to go and talk about information overload producing pattern recognition than the generation that's the most accused of being overloaded with information, who have access to the most information we've ever had gathered. And who better to talk to about the dangers of the pattern recognition, of the small shortcuts we make in our minds, in our encounters with the world and with each other. That's my role as a teacher. But in my role as a poet, as a kind of artist that McLuhan mentions in this quote, the absolute indispensability of the artist is that he alone, in the encounter with the present, can give the pattern recognition. He alone has the sensory awareness to tell us what our world is made of. I'm tempted to be simply flattered by that and to admit, yes, I do. I have that role. But there's more. The real question is why? Why just the artist? McLuhan goes on to say that the truth is, it's because every generation creates a nostalgic rear-view image of the generation before, and that most of us are terrified of the present. It frightens us. We don't want to dedicate our full sensory capacity to the present because we're afraid, leaving there the artist, most of them undaunted, to move forward and see the pattern recognition. So my second point today is to say that word artist is a proxy term for anyone willing to go one step farther. We all know information to pattern, but what's the next movement? And one way of understanding that is to look at a quote from the first poet I ever loved, Robert Frost, and I am indebted to my former teacher, Marianne Baruch, who spoke eloquently on this quote in her essay on metaphor. This is what Frost said. The most exciting movement in nature is not progress or advance, but expansion and contraction, the opening and shutting of the eye, the hand, the heart, the mind. He goes on to say that we spread our arms wide in a gesture of religion to the universe and yet use those same arms to close them around a person. This movement, expansion and contraction, like information overload produces pattern recognition, is obvious and true. It makes sense to us. Of course, we overload our brains with information and it comes back with patterns. It's the same thing we do with our computers, with the neural networks and all of the artificial intelligences to come. Information to pattern. And thanks to those neural networks that are able to identify the world for us. I mean, what else would a small town Utah boy, aspiring poet do if I didn't have Google image search and were able to put in poet and come back with this? This man, strikingly, the intensity of his look, this is what I have tried to emulate. And in many ways, he haunts every Google image search I've ever made of a poet and poetry. You'll look for him and you will find him. And he will find you. The other issue is that thank you, Google image search, so I can see what a mountain looks like. But how long would it take for me to put the word mountain in that bar before it came back with this, which is the image of the mountains where I was raised? And how many times would I have to put in home before it came back with this image, which was the house where I was raised? Can you see how this act of moving from information to pattern is a contraction, like Frost mentioned? That the world is so vast that we have to make it small in patterns. That truth is so vast that we only celebrate the small victories we make on its landscape. What I argue for is that we approach with stillness the next movement, which is to look for patterns first. And a different kind of information will follow, will expand in front of us. That we look for patterns in small things. That we look for patterns in canyons that we pass by at 80 miles per hour, what once took days to cross. And this act of looking for patterns goes to the root of why I love poetry, why I have dedicated my life to it, and why I believe it is a central tool for learning. Because the poet looks for patterns in small things, in sound, in image, in experience. And it's the reason I often go back to that hotel room. Because I am not finished understanding what that moment meant for me. It's the reason I go back to find out, if I can, if there are any patterns to understanding it. Why was I there? Why was I awake? Why was it in English? Why was my father dying? These questions I ask myself over and over again in that moment. And if I look closer, I see things. The name of the channel was Encuentro, or Encounter. Two people, two men encounter each other on a screen, and I encounter them 50 years later. Look closer. Two canyons named after devils are both contractions of a mountainside. Every valley is an expansion. Look closer. And what could it mean? What has it led to? Is even this public meditation on the act of searching for patterns. So that suddenly I realize I am also on a stage, on a screen, in a dark room, in English, repeating words from 50 years before. So that I stand in as a proxy for McLuhan, in the same way that a child is a proxy for a parent. We often talk about what we take away from moments like this, and I'm not necessarily interested in what you take away. What I'm interested in is what you leave here. If a poem is good, if the patterns are true, it has the capacity to still time. Frost also said that poetry is a momentary stay against confusion. I believe it can be a momentary stay against age, that it can keep a moment in a place for you to return to if you need it. The world was changing rapidly in 1968, and it will continue to do so. Of course it will. And we now will face an overload of information and be resorted to pattern recognition. What I ask is that we look for patterns in small things that we pass over as if they mean nothing to us. That we look for patterns in things like canyons that we cross on freeways too quickly. Because the truth is that the maps in my room are not a cute reminder of my childhood ambition to see the world. They are a reminder of ambition's failure. That it kept me from seeing for so long what I didn't even know about my valley, about my home, about my mind, about myself. All of us will find ourselves in rooms alone or with others, in which the moment will be small and we will have to encounter the present. And it may be that your father, your mother, your partner, your friend is leaving. And it may be that you have to put all of your attention into that one moment, and no computer or artificial intelligence will be able to give the information for you. Look closer. Look for patterns. There is knowledge you do not have, and that will tell you what your world is made of. Thank you.